another quiet drift through the layers of history. Tonight, we travel to the shores of ancient Greece, where marble glows golden beneath the sun, olive trees sway in a lazy rhythm, and the distant sound of waves echoes through the stone alleyways of a city we still know by name, Athens. But this story, gentle though it may be, does not begin in the sunshine. It begins somewhere deeper, beneath the waves, where whispers once said something vast and ancient stirred. For many centuries, people believed there was a sea monster that lived beneath the land upon which Athens was built. Not in fairy tales, and not only in the minds of children, but in rituals, in architecture, in whispered fears and civic decisions. The belief in such a creature wasn't merely a story to entertain, but something woven quietly through myth, daily life, and the trembling uncertainty of natural disasters. Tonight, we'll explore this idea gently, in 4 slow phases. First, we'll immerse ourselves in the rhythm of Athenian daily life near the sea. Then, we'll uncover the legendary tale of a creature called katos, a word that gave rise to cetacean, but meant something far more terrifying. From there, we'll gently dive into archaeological mysteries that may have fed the belief in a deep-sea beast, including strange tremors and flooded caves. And finally, we'll explore how Athenian elites, philosophers, and sailors each shaped, and feared, the idea of what might lurk below. So settle into the stillness. Let the modern world drift away. And imagine yourself in ancient Athens. The sky is violet. The air smells of salt and herbs. And beneath the stone beneath your feet, something breathes. Imagine yourself waking up in the gentle haze of early morning Athens. The room around you is dim and cool. Stone walls hold the night's chill, and faint sunlight drips through a lattice window. Outside, a rooster calls out from a nearby courtyard. Someone stirs a pot of barley porridge nearby, and the soft clinking of bronze utensils marks the quiet rhythm of the waking city. Your home is modest, like most in Athens. A central courtyard filled with clay pots and a small altar to Hestia. The air smells faintly of smoke, oil, and the nearby sea. You rise slowly and step onto the sun-warmed paving stones, and the first thing you hear is the sound of gulls circling overhead. Athens, in the 5th century BCE, was never far from the sea. Though its grand buildings and thinkers often draw the spotlight, the heart of the city beat steadily with commerce, sailing, and salt-swept wind. The port of Piraeus was its lung, pulling in goods, gossip, and gods from distant shores. For most citizens, the sea wasn't just something to admire. It was essential. But it was also mysterious. Even feared. As you walk through the city, you pass vendors selling smoked eel and anchovies caught fresh that morning. Fishermen repair their nets under awnings, their hands hardened by years at sea. Salted fish, dried squid, and olive oil are loaded onto carts. Seagulls follow closely, shrieking with hunger. Children run barefoot near the harbor, skipping flat stones toward the deeper water. But they do not wade too far in. You hear a grandmother calling out in warning. Don't play where the rocks vanish, the sea remembers things. To the ancient Athenians, the sea wasn't merely a place. It was a force, one with moods, tempers, and secrets. At the fish market, conversations are full of omens. 3 octopuses tangled in the nets yesterday. A sign, someone mutters. They say a new tremor shook the ground by Cape Saunion. In a world without geological science, the strange and the natural were woven tightly. Earthquakes, undersea rumblings, disappearing boats, each became a thread in the mythic fabric of the sea's mystery. People often spoke of katos, the ancient word for sea monster. Not a specific creature, but a category of beings, vast, serpentine, unknowable. And though most would never admit true belief, even the most rational citizens followed quiet habits born from fear. Salting the doorstep before a voyage. Pouring wine into the sea before casting off. marking the hull of ships with seaweed charms to keep the deep creatures away. Back in the city center, the Acropolis casts a long shadow. Beneath it, the ground hums faintly in the stillness. Some say that in the caves below, strange things are kept quiet. The priests of Poseidon sometimes go there to pray after storms, when a ship goes missing, or the fish flee a harbor. At night, when the streets grow quiet, the talk turns softer. People mention strange dreams of creatures with eyes like lamps and jaws wider than ships. They say you can sometimes hear it if you sleep close to the shore. A low sound, like breathing, or grinding, or mourning. These were not wild beliefs shouted in panic. They were quiet, shared stories, passed between generations like recipes or lullabies. Daily life in Athens was not ruled by fear, but it lived alongside it. People worked, prayed, traded, and cooked as always, but never quite forgot that below them lay something unknowable. Imagine now a young boy, maybe 10 years old, selling dried figs in the agora. He hears an older man speaking of how, years ago, the earth shook and a great crack opened in the floor of a temple. A rush of briny air poured out. And then, a sound. The boy listens, eyes wide. But the tale ends with a shrug. Probably just the wind, the man says. But the boy never forgets. That's how the belief endured, not through doctrine, but through wonder. Through absence. Through not knowing. And so, in this segment, we've walked through the everyday patterns of Athenian life, gathering glimpses of how, slowly and quietly, the myth of a sea monster beneath the city may have grown. Not through sudden terror, but through daily ritual, caution, and reverence. In the next segment, we'll turn our gaze to the legends themselves, to the great beast Katos and its appearances in ancient texts and art, as we explore the mythic origin of the creature that stirred beneath the cradle of Western civilization. But for now, let the waves quiet. Let the sea rest beneath your imagination. And breathe. Let us drift gently now from the sunlit marketplaces of Athens to the dim, ageless halls of myth. Close your eyes, if they aren't already, and imagine yourself not as a citizen of the 5th century, but as someone further back in time, an elder seated beside a crackling hearth, long before Plato, before democracy, before the stones of the Parthenon were ever raised. You are listening, as many generations did, to a story, quietly spoken by candlelight. A tale of a creature so vast, so old, and so mysterious, that no one could agree on its form. Its name was Katos. In ancient Greek, Katos was not a single monster, but a word for an entire category of sea beasts. The term would later inspire our modern word cetacean, used for whales and dolphins. But in ancient times, the word meant something far more fearsome, less defined, and cloaked in myth. In vase paintings, Katos appears as a long-bodied, dragon-like creature. It has the body of a fish, the face of a lion or dog, and sometimes curling horns or serpent scales. No two depictions are the same. It is a being of contradiction, part real, part impossible. Always massive. Always hungry. The most famous tale involving Katos is the story of Andromeda and Perseus. According to myth, Andromeda was a princess of Ethiopia, chained to a rock by the sea as punishment for her mother's pride. The goddess Poseidon, angry at a mortal queen who dared compare herself to sea nymphs, sent a Katos to ravage the coast. The monster rose from the ocean's depths. Its body coiled with seaweed. Its mouth vast enough to swallow a boat whole. The people of the land could hear its approach not only by the crash of water but by the earth trembling beneath their feet. Just as the monster prepared to devour the helpless Andromeda, the hero Perseus appeared. He flew on winged sandals and held in his hands the head of Medusa. With it, he turned the beast to stone. This tale is well known. But here is what many overlook. Ancient Athenians painted this story on vases, they carved it into temple friezes, and they told it again and again, even when the monster was no longer the focus. The sea monster became a symbol of divine wrath, of the unknown, and of the border between mortal life and mythic chaos. The creature Katos represented the fear of the deep, the place from which things emerged and to which things vanished. And although the Andromeda myth was set far from Athens, the monster's presence, its vast shadow, lived on in Athenian art and thought. One curious detail lies in the Theatre of Dionysus, nestled on the southern slope of the Acropolis. Among the carved reliefs are sea monsters and strange hybrid beasts. No place survives describing a monster under Athens specifically, and yet the images remain. Some scholars now believe that the monster was never meant to be one creature but many things at once, a metaphor, a warning, an echo. To some, Katos was a divine punishment. To others, a personification of earthquakes and seaquakes. To still others, it was simply the embodiment of everything beyond the horizon. And so the myth continued, slipping from poetry to ritual, from temple walls to bedtime stories. Athenians may not have said aloud, "A monster lives beneath us." But in temples to Poseidon, god of the sea and of earthquakes, they offered gifts. In cave shrines hidden beneath the city, they burned incense and left terracotta figurines shaped like fish and coiled beasts. It is possible that these were symbolic offerings. Metaphors, prayers for protection. But to the average citizen, the distinction between symbol and belief was thin, like mist over water. Children were taught to respect the sea, not just its currents and tides, but its moods. Sailors poured wine into the waves before every voyage. And every time a ship was lost, or a quake rattled the stones of the agora, there were those who whispered, "Katos is hungry again." Even Plato, the philosopher of reason and logic, used the term Katos in his dialogues, not as fantasy, but as allegory. In his writings, he compared the chaotic desires of the soul to a wild beast, like a monster from the deep. He did not dismiss the monster, he tamed it with thought. But the monster remained. Over time, Katos took many forms. Later, it would evolve into Leviathan in Jewish tradition, into the biblical great fish that swallowed Jonah, and eventually into medieval dragons of the sea. But in the Athenian mind, it was not merely a thing of the past. It was a possibility, an ancient truth half-remembered. A thing that might still sleep beneath the city's foundation stones. And so we find ourselves asking, did people in ancient Athens truly believe a sea monster lurked below their feet? Perhaps not as we understand belief. But they behaved as though something ancient was there. Their myths were not idle. Their rituals were not meaningless. And their stories, told in quiet rooms, on wind-blown cliffs, beneath marble temples, kept the monster alive. As we leave this segment, let us return slowly to the present of that ancient world. The city above continues on, children play, philosophers debate, ships arrive, and prayers are spoken. But somewhere far beneath, in the cool dark that no lantern reaches, the myth of Katos breathes softly still. In our next segment, we will step closer to the earth itself, to the mysteries of the geology beneath Athens. We'll explore the underground caves, seismic history, and real-world events that may have fed the monster myth. Perhaps, just perhaps, the stories of something moving beneath the city were not entirely imagined after all. But for now, let the water settle. Let the monster rest. And allow your breath to slow with the rhythm of ancient waves. Let your imagination drift again, slowly and gently, beneath the marble columns and clay rooftops of ancient Athens. Below the temples and the bustling agora, below the homes, the markets, the laughter of children and the prayers of priests, there is stone. And within that stone, silence. Or almost silence. For those who lived in Athens for generation after generation, the earth was never entirely still. The ground would tremble. Stone would groan. Walls would shift ever so slightly, as though something vast and restless moved below. Tonight, we turn our gaze downward, not just in myth, but in geology. For while the tales of Cato speak of dragons and sea monsters, the terrain beneath Athens may have whispered similar warnings. Warnings in the language of tremors, caverns, and underground breath. Let us begin where myth and mystery often meet, in a cave. The cave of Pan on the slopes of the Acropolis. Tucked into the northern slopes of the Acropolis lies a modest, ancient cave. Today, it is known as the Cave of Pan. But long before any modern sign marked the entrance, this dark cleft in the rock was a place of ritual and reverence. To enter, one had to stoop. The passage narrowed quickly. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the scent of old earth and forgotten offerings. And within the stone belly of the cave, Athenians left tokens, small clay figurines, animal bones, and vessels filled with oil or wine. The god Pan, half man, half goat, and lord of wild places, was believed to dwell in such spaces. But in Athens, even Pan's cave was more than a sanctuary. It was a place where the city met the unknown. The deepest unknown. The cave descended farther than most visitors ever explored. Beyond the ceremonial chamber, narrow fissures led downward into natural cracks in the rock. Some local legends suggested these fissures had no end, that they led to a hidden sea far below. To a realm where monsters might stir. Though no writings explicitly state this, modern archaeologists have uncovered carvings and offerings deeper within than expected, evidence that some Athenians may have entered far below, into the dark, bringing gifts to soothe whatever might dwell there. Even today, the cave produces strange echoes. The drip of water from unseen crevices. The quiet, rhythmic sound of air moving in and out with the temperature of the day. It can feel, to the imaginative mind, as though the cave breathes. And that was not the only cave. Athens sits upon a foundation of limestone, and limestone is a rock that forms riddled with karst caves. Natural hollows formed by water slowly dissolving stone over thousands of years. These caves often run in twisting paths beneath cities, and they are highly susceptible to tremors. Which brings us to another mystery. Earthquakes and the idea of a restless beast. In modern times, we understand earthquakes as natural events, shifts in tectonic plates, pressure released in bursts of seismic force. But to the Athenians, there was no such concept. The earth moved because something caused it to move. And what lived beneath the earth? Gods and monsters. Poseidon was called the earth shaker. It was believed that when he struck the ground with his trident, it trembled. But alongside Poseidon's name, the ancient Athenians had another whisper. They didn't just blame gods. Sometimes they blamed something older. Something that stirred beneath their very feet. In the 5th century BCE, Athens experienced a number of small tremors, not enough to destroy buildings, but enough to cause alarm. Windows shook. Statues shifted. Cracks appeared in the floors of temples. Inscriptions from the period record strange signs accompanying these tremors. A noise like thunder, but with no storm. The smell of salt in the air though the sea lay calm. A shadow on the ground, moving without source. These are vague, poetic records. But to the Athenian ear, they were omens. And omens demanded interpretation. In this fertile space, where natural geology and poetic tradition met, myths grew. People began to describe a presence beneath the city. Not in the clear language of horror, but in quiet suggestion. There was something ancient in the rock. Something that shifted when it pleased. And in the worst moments, when the earth moved, it was said to be stretching, or rising, or rolling over in its sleep. Some priests of Poseidon reportedly held ceremonies underground, entering caves and crypts to offer prayers for stability. They poured oil into cracks in the floor. They placed small boat figurines and fish-shaped tokens into crevices, then sealed them with wax. We do not know precisely what they believed, but we know what they did. And their actions suggest they believed that placating whatever lay beneath was just as important as understanding it. The subterranean wells of the Eridanos River. Another mystery lies beneath Athens, the Eridanos River, a once visible waterway now mostly underground. In ancient times, it flowed above ground through the city center but over centuries became channeled into subterranean tunnels and aqueducts. The river was believed to have sacred properties. Some claimed it had healing powers. Others said it could carry prayers to the underworld. But one tale passed among the lower classes spoke of a moment, during heavy rains, when the river overflowed, not upward, but downward. The ground cracked open, and water vanished into it, sucked into a cavern that no one could find again. Those nearby said they heard a deep sound, like the groan of a creature drinking. It was said the city was built atop a creature with a thirst, and that thirst would return with each rainy season. Engineers today speak of sinkholes, of water seeping into caverns and vanishing. But the stories from antiquity didn't speak of water alone. They spoke of smells, brine, sulfur, and decay, wafting up from holes in the ground after such events. The kind of smells that suggested something living, or once alive. This subtle blending of physical phenomena and imagined consequence is what fed the belief in a lurking presence. The people of Athens weren't foolish. They were observant. They saw signs. And lacking the tools of modern science, they used the tools they had, myth, ritual, story, to explain what they experienced. And so, over time, what might have begun as natural events, earthquakes, cave collapses, river shifts, became interpreted as signs of a hidden presence. Not a god. Not a demon. But something older. Something buried. Something that woke only when disturbed. Imagine now a silent Athenian night. You lie on a sleeping mat, the walls around you quiet. But then, the ground gives a low, shuddering sigh. Just a moment. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to notice. The dogs bark. The water jug trembles slightly. And the city holds its breath. In that silence, stories find root. Perhaps, just perhaps, something stirred again beneath the city. Not a metaphor. Not a god. But a monster. A sea monster. Catos. As we leave this segment, the ground grows still again. The cave grows quiet. The air beneath the Acropolis holds only the weight of ancient dust and forgotten prayers. But the belief still lingers. In our next segment, we'll climb slowly upward to the Acropolis itself, where elite Athenians, priests, and thinkers shaped how monsters, myths, and knowledge were recorded. We'll look at how belief was shaped, filtered, and preserved. Not just in fear, but in marble, scroll, and temple. But for now, let the earth remain quiet beneath you. Let the waves above return to rest. And breathe with the rhythm of something older than the sea. Now let us turn our gaze upward, from the caves and caverns of ancient Athens to its high places, its temples, its libraries, and the private courtyards of those who shaped its knowledge. Imagine yourself slowly ascending the southern slope of the Acropolis. The climb is steady, and your sandals touch the same smooth stone thousands once walked. The wind here is stronger, carrying the scent of olive leaves and sun-worn dust. And far below, the hum of the city fades into a soft hush. This was the domain of the elite, the philosophers, priests, politicians, and playwrights who recorded and shaped what the city believed. But even here, in these heights of reason and order, the whisper of the sea monster lingered. Let us begin at the center of Athenian thought, the Acropolis itself. While the Parthenon, magnificent and towering, is most often remembered as a temple to Athena, it is the lesser-known structures on the Acropolis that hint at deeper fears. Among these is the erect Hyon, an unusual, asymmetrical temple with several inner sanctuaries. One was said to be dedicated to Poseidon Erechtheus, a merged identity of the god of the sea and a legendary king of Athens. In the corner of this temple complex is something curious, a sacred mark on the stone floor. According to legend, it was left by Poseidon's trident when he struck the ground in a contest with Athena for the city's patronage. But there is more to the story. That strike, it was said, opened a salt spring, a small pool of water that smelled faintly of the sea, even though it sat high above the shoreline. Nearby, the sound of waves was sometimes heard echoing through the stone. Locals would come to listen. They would kneel beside the temple's edge and press their ears to the floor. What did they hear? The explanation was religious, a gift of Poseidon. But to others, it was unsettling. If the sea could be heard so far inland, if briny water rose from deep within the rock, then perhaps the earth itself was hollow. Perhaps something beneath the Acropolis was not entirely still. Priests tended the sanctuary carefully. They offered libations not only to Athena, but to Poseidon. And always, they maintained the sacred spring, tending it, measuring it, marking its changes. They never called it a sea monster. Not directly. But the rituals suggest a concern. A sense that what lay beneath needed honoring. And in a city ruled by knowledge, ritual was its own kind of memory. Let us now walk quietly toward the shaded courtyards of the Athenian elite. Here, among trimmed gardens and well-fed pets, the city's great thinkers held their symposia, evening discussions filled with wine, questions, and carefully worded arguments. These were not places of superstition, but of logic, debate, and learning. And yet, even here, monsters appeared. Plato, in his dialogue Philebus, compares the unruly desires of the soul to beasts of the deep. He uses the imagery of sea monsters. Great thrashing creatures whose instincts rise up from the darkness within a person. To control the soul, one must tame the catos within. Elsewhere, in Timaeus, he describes the earth as a living organism, with veins, cavities, and circulations, some filled with fire, others with water. He does not say there is a creature beneath Athens, but he speaks of forces that resemble one. And then there is Aristotle, the great cataloguer of the natural world. In his works, he attempts to describe marine life, whales, fish, sea serpents. But again and again, he references creatures seen by sailors that defy classification, large-bodied beings, serpents of impossible length, fish with cries like infants. Aristotle does not believe all of it. But he records the reports. He does not scoff. Because knowledge, in ancient Athens, meant not only collecting what was true, but preserving what was believed. The philosophers understood that stories had power. That even if a monster was not real in body, it was real in the minds of those who feared it. And so, quietly, thoughtfully, they made space for the possibility. Among the scrolls stored in Athens' private collections were texts copied from older times, stories from Ionia, from Crete, from Egyptian visitors and Phoenician sailors. Some of these scrolls spoke of tunnels beneath cities. Others spoke of floods, quakes, and drowned temples. There is a recurring motif, water rising from beneath. A monster's breath, some called it. A god's anger, said others. One scroll, attributed to a lesser-known priest named Melanion, described an underground hollow beneath Athens, like the shell of a tortoise, wide and echoing. He claimed it was reached through a now-lost temple to Triton, the sea god. No one has found such a temple. But the story remained. In maps drawn by early geographers, such as Anaximander, the Earth was often pictured as resting atop water. The belief was not that oceans surrounded land, but that they cradled it from below. If one imagined a creature beneath the city, it would not be crawling through rock, but swimming beneath it. Breathing, slowly. Waiting. And this was not considered irrational. To the Athenian mind, belief and knowledge coexisted. Myths were not lies. They were lenses, ways of interpreting the strange rhythms of life. And so even in elite circles, in the homes of the educated, among the scrolls and symposiums, the sea monster survived. Not as a being of scales and claws, but as an idea. A metaphor for all that lay beyond reason. The unknowable. The uncontrollable. The below. Let us return for a moment to the streets below. While the elite recorded, debated, and allegorized, the working classes still performed. They poured oil at cave mouths. They told stories to children. They made charms and cast them into wells. To them, the monster was not symbolic. It was possible. And so, Athens lived in two truths. In the heights of the Acropolis, the monster was a metaphor. In the shadowy streets below, it was a presence. Neither was wrong. And together, they created a city that moved not only through politics and progress, but through memory. A memory that shaped rituals, carved temple stones, and whispered in scrolls. And perhaps that is why the story endured. Not because anyone ever saw the creature rise, but because no one could ever prove it didn't breathe below. As we end this segment, let your thoughts rest among the marble columns of the erect Hyon, where the wind moves softly, and the stone beneath still holds its quiet, briny spring. The sea is far away, but not forgotten. In the next segment, we will return to the daily rhythms of ordinary Athenians, to see how sailors, merchants, mothers, and servants experience the mystery of the sea monster in their everyday lives. We'll walk the docks, enter homes, and listen to the whispered customs that kept the myth alive. But for now, let your breath slow. Let your body settle. And let the past lie gently, where sea and stone meet in silence. Imagine walking through a marble colonnade bathed in the golden Athenian afternoon. The breeze is warm, the sky cloudless. Here, amid the rhythm of sandals against stone and the soft murmur of priests reciting invocations, stands a temple guardian not of flesh and blood, but of myth. Carved into the friezes, tucked into shields, and staring wide-eyed from the ends of pottery, there she is. The Gorgon. More than just a terrifying figure of old stories, she became a symbol, a warning, and in many ways, a guardian. In this segment, we explore how the myth of the sea monster beneath Athens, the chthonic, serpentine force tied to gods and the Gorgon, was absorbed into the artistic, religious, and architectural language of Athens itself. Let us begin, as we often do, at the temples. The Gorgonian, a sacred symbol. On the pediments of some of the most sacred Athenian buildings, a familiar face appears, wild hair like writhing serpents, mouth agape in a silent scream, eyes wide and unblinking. This was the Gorgonian, the head of the Gorgon, often Medusa. It was believed to ward off evil, to protect sacred spaces from unseen threats. This apotropaic symbol, with its origin in the realm of mythology, soon found itself carved into the daily experience of Athenians. Artisans sculpted it into shields and breastplates, as if by placing her image upon their chest, warriors could shield themselves not only with bronze but with fear itself. The mere gaze of the Gorgon was enough to turn men to stone in stories, and while Athenians no longer believed in literal petrification, they understood the power of fear as a boundary, a perimeter beyond which evil dared not tread. Architecture as memory. Temples such as the Parthenon were more than places of worship. They were repositories of collective memory, etched in stone. The sea monster that ancient folk once whispered about beneath Athens may not have been spoken of directly here, but the Gorgon, a creature birthed in part from that same dark well of imagination, was ever present. Scholars have long debated whether the prevalence of the Gorgon's head in art was purely symbolic, or whether it hinted at a deeper cultural memory. Was it a lingering echo of that chthonic terror, of something primal, feminine, and dangerous that once lived beneath the soil of Attica? Perhaps even a memory of the ancient rituals from segment 2, when priestesses bathed themselves in the blood of sacrifice to commune with dark waters. Gorgon in pottery and daily life. And the Gorgon was not confined to grand temples. No, she made her way into the homes of ordinary people. Athenian pottery from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE frequently depicts her image. On drinking vessels, oil jars, and funerary vases, her face leers out, fixed in eternal warning. Imagine an Athenian artisan, hunched over a kylix, one of those wide, shallow drinking cups, carefully painting the Gorgon's face at the bottom. A guest at a symposium, draining the last of their wine, would be met with her wide-eyed gaze. A reminder, perhaps, that laughter and revelry were always balanced on the edge of chaos, that beneath the surface of any gathering, old terrors still stirred. The feminine fear. It is worth noting that the Gorgon, like many of the beings thought to inhabit the depths beneath Athens, was feminine. Her terror was tied not to brute strength, but to transformation. The idea that her gaze could change one state, life to stone, movement to stillness, echoed a fear of uncontrollable change. And this theme, change, particularly transformation of the body and the world, was central to ancient Athenian life. Farmers knew the soil could suddenly dry out or flood. Sailors knew the sea could turn on them in an instant. Women could bring life and death into the world through childbirth. The Gorgon, then, was more than a monster. She was a symbol of the unknowable forces that governed life, especially those rooted in the feminine, in the earth, and in the sea. Tying back to the sea. What, then, of the ancient belief in the sea creature beneath Athens? While direct references may have faded by the classical period, its spirit remained embedded in the iconography. The Gorgon, after all, was often tied to the sea. Some versions of the myth place her and her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, in caves by the ocean. Others describe their snake-like features as aquatic, their slithering hair a metaphor for the serpents of the sea. By placing her image across their city, Athenians were perhaps not denying the existence of that dark force, they were coexisting with it. Containing it within art, within stone, within ritual. A comforting horror. To modern ears, the idea of placing a monster's face on your most sacred buildings might seem unsettling. But for the Athenians, it was a comfort. They believed that by acknowledging the dark, you could neutralize it. By sculpting the terror into marble, they stripped it of its power to surprise. The sea monster, the ancient whispers of something below, were no longer threats. They were part of the city's language, part of its memory. Transitioning forward. And so, as we leave behind the statues and shields bearing the wide, frozen eyes of the Gorgon, we find ourselves asking, how much of this artistic fixation was mere ornamentation, and how much was a slow, careful ritual of containment? In our next segment, we will follow this thread of symbolism even further, exploring the archaeological discoveries beneath Athens itself. What lies under the stones of this ancient city? Could these remnants tell us more about why Athenians placed such power in the unseen, in the watery, in the underworld? As you walk through modern Athens, its bustle of scooters and cafes masks what lies beneath. But under the paving stones and subway tunnels, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary, not merely ruins of homes or shops, but hints of something older, darker, and decidedly more enigmatic. In this segment, we descend beneath the ancient city itself to explore the literal and symbolic underworld of Athens. These are not myths now, but bones, shrines, and structures that whisper of rituals forgotten, of fears remembered, and of perhaps a very real belief in a presence below. The subterranean layers. The city of Athens has always grown upward, layer upon layer, like a palimpsest. Excavations, particularly during the construction of the Athens metro in the 1990s, revealed a staggering array of ancient infrastructure. Sewer systems, burial plots, wells, altars, and aqueducts, many of which had long been buried beneath centuries of development. But what fascinated archaeologists most were the persistent discoveries of unusual subterranean structures with no clear purpose. These were not ordinary cisterns or drains. Narrow staircases leading to sealed chambers. Stone-lined pits far deeper than any practical need. Inscriptions scratched into the walls that hinted at offerings, or perhaps warnings. Amphorae left unbroken. Animal bones arranged with care. What were these spaces for? Some researchers have argued they were connected to the worship of chthonic deities, those gods and spirits associated with the underworld, the earth, and hidden knowledge. And among these findings, a pattern began to emerge. These were not mere utility spaces, they were ritualistic. Designed for something other than light and life. Sacred wells and forgotten springs. Water in ancient Athens was precious. But certain springs were seen as more than mere sources of hydration, they were considered entrances. Portals. In myth and in ritual, the concept of sacred springs or bottomless wells appears again and again. Some were believed to be gifts from the gods. Others, especially those that emerged suddenly or flowed with unusual properties, were feared. One such spring lies beneath the Acropolis itself, hidden within the cave of Pan. This shaded, mossy grotto was a place of worship, certainly, but also a place where offerings were cast into a small, deep spring. Bones and jewelry have been found in its depths. Who were they for? Pan, the god of the wild and the uncanny? Or something older, unnamed? This idea of a watery underworld entrance is not isolated. The Eridanos River, which once flowed openly through the Agora, was buried for centuries. But when parts of it were unearthed, archaeologists found that ancient Athenians had built shrines along its banks and even beneath its surface. In some parts, it disappears underground entirely. Was this disappearance symbolic? Did Athenians see it as the river slipping into Hades' realm? Ceramic clues and symbols of containment. Among the most haunting discoveries beneath Athens are the ceramics. Thousands of potsherds have been found buried intentionally in the earth, often smashed, sometimes whole. Many are inscribed with curses, names, or pleas. These accursed tablets, or katadesmoi, were thin sheets of lead or pottery etched with writing, folded, and placed into graves or wells. The practice of katadesmos was widespread in the classical period, but its frequency in Athens was striking. People sought to bind enemies, halt love rivals, or curse business competitors. But more curiously, some of these tablets invoke not a specific god, but something more ambiguous, forces of the deep, the nameless ones below, or those who dwell in darkness. The language is vague, unsettling, and deliberate. Did Athenians believe they were speaking to something beneath them? Something listening from the earth? The strange case of the plague pit. In 1994, while constructing a subway station in Kerameikos, the ancient cemetery of Athens, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave dating to the plague of Athens, 430 BCE. The skeletons inside were hastily buried, crammed together, their bodies indicating sudden, violent death. But even here, among the evidence of chaos and crisis, one oddity stood out. At the center of the pit was a single amphora, placed upright. Inside it, sealed away, were small objects, seeds, a shard of obsidian, and a tiny lead figurine shaped like a serpent. This was no accident. Someone had placed it there with care, in the middle of death and disease. Was it a protective charm? An offering to ward off further disaster? or a plea, to the monster, to the Gorgon, to the sea beneath Athens? We cannot say for sure, but it reveals something essential. Athenians, even in their most rational era, clung to ancient fears. They still whispered to the dark, mapping the myths to the earth. If we overlay the myths of subterranean monsters, gods, and gorgons onto the map of Athens, onto its sacred springs, strange stairwells, and burial grounds, we find an uncanny alignment. Myths are not fiction to be discarded. They are coordinates, emotional, spiritual, and perhaps geographical. Consider the fact that in several places around the Areopagus and the Agora, temples to underworld deities were built atop or near natural fissures in the earth. The Temple of Hades, near Eleusis. The Sanctuary of Korotrophos, earthen nurse, near the Dipylon Gate. And of course, the Temple of Hephaestus, built near an old spring where strange vaporous emissions were once reported. These sites may not have hosted literal sea monsters, but they were portals, nonetheless. Points where earth, water, and sky converged. Where stories took root. Conclusion of the descent. So what does this tell us? That the fear of something lurking beneath Athens wasn't simply a bedtime story. It was a worldview. Athenians built their lives above a world they both depended on and feared. They tilled its soil, drank its water, buried their dead within it, and believed, sometimes, that it watched them back. In our next segment, we'll dive even deeper, not underground, but underwater. Because if the ancient Athenians feared something below the soil, they feared the sea even more. What lived off the coast of Attica? What gods, monsters, or memories awaited in the depths of the Aegean? As we slowly drift onward, let us explore the waters of the mind, where philosophy, myth, and mystery converged in ancient Greece. In this segment, we enter the contemplative space where the imagined sea monster beneath Athens found fertile ground, not just in tales of terror, but in questions about fear, fate, and the nature of existence itself. Imagine yourself once again seated beneath the colonnades of an Athenian stoa. The air is still and quiet, filled only with the soft murmur of philosophers debating under the olive trees. These were not men simply focused on gods or monsters, they probed the very nature of the soul, the cosmos, and the deep unknowns. Among these thinkers, water itself was a subject of great fascination. One of the earliest philosophical voices, Thales of Miletus, believed that all things originated from water. It was not merely a substance, but a principle, a source, the arch from which the universe emerged. For Thales, the sea was not a danger but a foundation. Yet to suggest that everything came from water also hinted at water's power. It could nurture and destroy. It was serene and chaotic. It held life and swallowed it whole. Heraclitus of Ephesus, too, used water to describe change. No man ever steps in the same river twice, he wrote, for the river is always flowing. This image of constant flux, ever changing, never still, aligned beautifully with the mystery of the sea. The monster, perhaps, was not just a beast but a metaphor. A form. A shadow of that unknowable process, always shifting beneath our feet. To the Athenians, the unknown was often explored through metaphors. And what better metaphor than the depths of the sea? The monster, imagined or not, represented the boundary between knowledge and unknowing, between certainty and chaos. Even Plato, whose works echoed through the marble halls of Athens, framed his philosophical tales with vivid myths. He spoke of Atlantis, a great island nation lost beneath the waves. Whether he believed it real or fictional is still debated, but its presence in his dialogue, Timaeus, served a purpose, to illustrate the fragility of human ambition and the consequence of hubris. If a powerful civilization could sink beneath the sea, then perhaps the monster beneath Athens was a warning, not of claws and teeth, but of forgetting one's place in the order of things. In the mystical philosophies of the Pythagoreans and Orphics, water again returned, not just as substance, but as symbol. The sea was connected to the soul's journey. To be swallowed by it might not only be a death but a transformation. The deep was liminal space, the threshold between worlds, where the physical met the divine. In their rituals and hymns, the Orphics sang of descent and emergence, of purification and rebirth, imagining life as a cycle through watery realms. The presence of a sea monster beneath Athens, then, might also be read through this lens. Not merely as a threat to ships or a hazard to harbors, but as a philosophical question made flesh. What lies beneath the surface? What dwells beyond sight? In a culture so steeped in the search for meaning, the monster may have stood as a boundary, keeping the known world safe from the overwhelming chaos beyond. And there was comfort in naming it. In giving form to fear, the Athenians, like philosophers with their concepts, created a framework for the unknown. Whether called Cato, or Scylla, or simply the thing beneath, this monster was a method of understanding. Art, too, joined this effort. On vases, murals, and stone carvings, monsters of the sea were drawn in swirling lines and fierce forms. These were not literal records, but meditations, visual ways of engaging with that same question philosophers posed: what dwells where light cannot reach? What does it mean to live, knowing so little of what lies beyond? For the average citizen walking the shaded streets of Athens, these ideas may have been distant. But even the act of telling a child not to go too close to the water, or of whispering about the monster on stormy nights, carried the echo of those deeper thoughts. The myth lived not just in books or temples, but in the everyday speech and subtle beliefs of the people. As the sun sets on this segment, let us hold this thought gently, that the sea monster under Athens might never have had scales or fangs. It might have had no body at all. Instead, it might have been a whisper of uncertainty, a symbol of the deep unknown, a reminder that beneath even the most civilized city lay mysteries no temple could explain, and no philosophy could tame. And now, let us drift again. From the ethereal spaces of thought, we move back into the material world. Our next segment will explore the archaeological remnants. Those fragments and clues left behind by people who may have truly believed something ancient stirred beneath their city. We now turn our gaze from the metaphysical to the tangible. From the realm of myth and thought, we descend into the soil itself, into the foundations of Athens, seeking traces, clues, and buried remnants that might whisper of monsters long forgotten. Could there have been something, anything, in the archaeological record that fueled the belief in a beast beneath the city? Athens is a city layered like a parchment rewritten again and again. Each excavation reveals not just one era, but many Mycenaean tombs buried beneath classical columns, which in turn rest beneath Byzantine churches. Amid these layers, archaeologists have uncovered all manner of things: bones, walls, temples, and mysterious artifacts. But some finds defy easy categorization. Let us begin in the Piraeus district, the ancient harbor of Athens. In this coastal zone, not far from where waves lap gently against the piers today, excavations have revealed strange constructions that puzzled even the most seasoned researchers. Vast cisterns and subterranean channels, seemingly built with more complexity than required for simple drainage or water storage. Could these have been part of a now-lost ritual site? Or perhaps designed to contain something large, something feared? Nearby, within the ruins of long-buried warehouses and shipyards, were discovered mosaics depicting sea monsters with oddly specific features, unlike the general mythic creatures found elsewhere in Greece. One in particular, still faint but preserved in a shaded corner of a stone floor, depicts an enormous coiled creature rising from a whirlpool, its eyes glaring directly outward. The style suggests it was laid during the height of Athens' naval power. Was this merely symbolic? Or a warning? And then, there are the bones. In 1896, during expansion work near the Karameiko Cemetery, workers uncovered what was initially thought to be the remains of a large animal, far larger than any local fauna. These bones, though heavily damaged, included a massive jaw fragment with ridged teeth unlike anything seen in Mediterranean species. Some speculated they belonged to a long-extinct whale. Others, more intrigued, posited that they may have been dragged inland as part of a ritual, or perhaps washed in by a long-forgotten flood. A century later, during metro construction near Syntagma Square, archaeologists unearthed clay tablets and wall fragments bearing odd inscriptions, part Greek, part pre-Hellenic script. Among the carvings were references to a guardian of the floodgates beneath the city. Some scholars dismissed this as metaphorical, related to the city's early aqueducts. But others, intrigued by the blending of aquatic terminology and guardian imagery, began drawing links to earlier Minoan legends of sea serpents protecting sacred springs. Further south, in the ruins of a small temple to Poseidon, little more than scattered stones and a weathered altar, divers recovered an object now housed in the National Archaeological Museum, a bronze seal ring bearing the image of a human figure wrestling a massive, tentacled creature. The detail is astounding. The artist, whoever they were, understood not only proportion but fluid motion, capturing the coils of the beast in a way that felt almost observational. Was this simply artistic flair? Or had someone seen such a thing? Beyond Athens itself, in the island sanctuaries of the Saronic Gulf, similar symbols appear. Small votive offerings found on Aegina and Salamis, shaped like stylized fish with clawed fins and horned brows, suggest a broader cultic reverence for a hybrid sea beast. It's possible that seafaring merchants brought these stories back from distant ports, perhaps from Egypt, Phoenicia, or even further afield. But why did they seem to root so deeply in Athens? One compelling hypothesis among fringe archaeologists is that early Athenian engineers and priests knew of a network of underground caverns connecting to the sea, perhaps via hidden inlets or subterranean aquifers. Some even believe these may have occasionally allowed larger sea creatures to become trapped or stranded within. The stench of rot, the echoes of strange sounds, and the sudden disappearance of livestock or people near certain old wells, all contributed to the legend. And while no skeleton of a sea monster has ever been definitively identified beneath Athens, the combination of misidentified fossils, cryptic artifacts, and ancient construction anomalies provides fertile ground for belief. After all, a belief in something monstrous does not always begin with a full view of the beast. It can begin with a glimpse, a sound, a disappearance, or an unexplainable ruin. Just as paleontologists in modern times have uncovered the bones of long-extinct giants, so too might ancient Athenians have stumbled upon fossils eroding from cliffs or washed up on shore. To a people without the modern framework of extinction or evolutionary biology, the sight of a massive rib cage or skull would suggest a living memory, something still lurking, watching, waiting. And so the fear was built, not only in temples and stories, but in stone and earth. In carvings etched by trembling hands, in mosaics warning sailors to stay ashore on stormy nights, in the way certain tunnels were sealed and never reopened. Let us pause here and breathe deeply. The dust of Athens still holds secrets, some deciphered, others only guessed at. And now, as we move from buried relics to living ritual, we will explore how the Athenians incorporated their fear of the deep into their religious ceremonies and rites of passage. As we continue our descent into the quiet mysteries of ancient Athens, our focus now shifts from what was found beneath the earth to what was raised above it. To the flicker of sacred fires, the scent of brine and incense, and the songs of worshippers invoking ancient powers, both divine and monstrous. For the Athenians, the sea was never just a route for trade or conquest. It was a living force, beautiful and bountiful, yet also terrible and unpredictable. It provided life in the form of fish and commerce, but it also took life away in storms, shipwrecks, and disease brought from distant lands. It was, in every sense, sacred. And with that sacredness came fear. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, lord of the sea, was one of the most venerated deities in the Athenian pantheon. Though often overshadowed in civic prominence by Athena, his power was acknowledged through dedicated temples, festivals, and public sacrifices. Among these was the Poseidaea, a winter festival marked by offerings to calm the seas and ensure safe passage for sailors. But beneath the polished layer of civic worship lay something older, something more visceral. In the shadowed alleys near Piraeus and the older districts of Athens, scholars have unearthed hints of localized sea cults that did not align neatly with official state religion. These were not worshippers of Poseidon in his regal, trident-bearing form, but of a darker, more primeval aspect, Poseidon as a bringer of chaos from the abyss. Offerings here included not only wine and olive oil but also sea creatures arranged in unsettling patterns. The remains of eels, squid, and octopuses were found in ceramic basins, curled unnaturally, often paired with symbols of binding or imprisonment. These rituals were not public spectacles. They were quiet, concealed, and highly localized, possibly conducted by sailors, fishmongers, or families who had suffered losses at sea. Their hymns have not survived, but fragments of texts hint at invocations like, "Bind the mouth that swallows boats. Still the eye that watches from the dark." There were also stories, never quite sanctioned by the priesthood, of an underground shrine hidden near the long walls that once connected Athens to its ports. According to a medieval chronicle referencing earlier lost Greek texts, the shrine was built around a chasm thought to connect to the sea itself. Within it, rituals were held not to celebrate Poseidon, but to appease what lay beyond his reach. Something older, nameless, that resided in the deep. Even in the great Panathenaic festival, which honored Athena with processions, athletic contests, and sacrifices, there are clues to the shadow of the sea's danger. The route of the grand procession wound past sacred wells and springs, places where older rites had once been performed. Some researchers believe that symbolic gestures within the festival, such as the washing of Athena's statue in seawater, carried echoes of earlier purifying rituals meant to ward off sea spirits. And then there were the omens. It was said that before the Peloponnesian War, strange creatures washed ashore near Piraeus, bloated things with too many eyes, or no heads at all. Their sudden appearance caused panic among dock workers and merchants. The priests of Poseidon declared them signs of divine displeasure. That year, offerings at the Poseidaeon were doubled. Some say there were human sacrifices, not officially recorded, of course, but whispered about in private. Among the most unsettling rituals were those associated with young men entering adulthood, the ephebic rites. In one variation practiced on the island of Salamis but tied culturally to Athenian custom, young initiates were made to swim alone at night across dark waters, carrying small stones said to represent burdens left at sea. If they returned, they were welcomed into manhood. If not, well, it was said the sea had judged them unworthy. Could these rituals have originated in a time when something real was feared in those waters? Perhaps a predator, animal or otherwise, that preyed upon the fringes of society. Or perhaps the memory of such a threat became absorbed into culture, ritualized, mythologized? A haunting inscription from the 5th century BCE, found near the base of a seaside cliff, reads simply, "Leave none unoffered, lest it rise again." To whom, or what, was this written? Even myths served as warnings. Consider the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. While often seen as a tale of land-based horror, the journey begins with ships bearing Athenian youths sent to be devoured. The sea takes them there, and, in many versions, consumes them on the return as Theseus forgets to raise his white sails, and his father leaps into the sea. Sacrifice, misunderstanding, and watery death, a recurring triad in Athenian lore. All of this suggests a duality in Athenian belief, worship as gratitude for the sea's gifts, and worship as an offering to avoid its wrath. It wasn't just about honoring gods, it was about pacifying forces too vast to control. As we light our own symbolic candles and place our own offerings of thought, curiosity, and imagination upon the altar of history, we prepare to enter darker waters still. In the next segment, we'll sail into the philosophical, where Athenian thinkers, Socrates, Plato, and others, grappled not only with the shape of the soul but with the abyss beneath the surface of the known world. We now arrive at a peculiar juncture in our journey through ancient Athens, a place where reason meets myth, and logic brushes up against whispers from the dark. For in a city renowned as the cradle of Western philosophy, we must ask, did the greatest minds of Athens ever glance into the abyss and flinch? Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, the questioner of all things, spent his life examining virtue, justice, and the soul. But he was no stranger to darkness, both metaphorical and literal. He walked barefoot through the alleys of plague-stricken Athens, spent time among soldiers in battle, and willingly drank hemlock rather than recant his teachings. A man of such courage might not be expected to fear anything. And yet, the sea and the unseen world beyond it held mysteries even Socrates did not try to explain away. In Plato's dialogues, there are moments, brief, easily overlooked, where the veil of rational discourse seems to thin. In the Phaedo, for instance, Socrates speaks just before his death about the earth being hollow and riddled with caverns, filled with rivers of fire, mud, and water that circulate in endless motion. He describes Tartarus, the pit beneath the earth, and the souls that fall into it. He doesn't speak of these as mere metaphors. He presents them with a strange kind of certainty, as if relaying a truth known to initiates, not just a poetic flourish. And then there is the mythopher in the Republic, where a soldier dies, journeys through a realm of judgment, and returns to life. In this tale, souls are judged and then sent upward to the heavens or downward to terrifying chasms. Those who descend are dragged screaming into darkness. Socrates relays this story not as fiction, but as a necessary myth, something the city's guardian should believe in to live justly. It is both didactic and unnerving. The philosopher may not believe in monsters, but he clearly believes in the utility of fearing what lies below. Plato himself, in later works, leans even more deeply into the mystical. In the Timaeus, he describes the cosmos as a living creature, with a soul that extends through all things. He hints at the world's soul being disrupted by disharmony. He even allows for the possibility of lost worlds, most famously Atlantis, which supposedly vanished beneath the sea in a single night of misfortune. Is this myth? Allegory? Or was Plato, the disciple of Socrates, struggling to contain something more? Aristotle, Plato's student, was famously more grounded. Yet even he was not immune. In his Meteorologica, he discusses strange sea phenomena, earthquakes beneath the waves, dead fish surfacing without cause, and the bubbling sea foam that glowed in moonlight. He catalogues them like a scientist, yet does not explain them. He notes them, marks them, and moves on. This hesitancy to engage deeply with the more disturbing aspects of the natural world is curious. For all their love of reason, Athenian philosophers were deeply superstitious in their personal lives. Socrates himself claimed to hear a divine inner voice, his daemonion, that warned him of danger but never instructed him to act. He did not question it. He accepted it. Could this voice have been something more than conscience? Could it have been, as some scholars have suggested, a fragment of older Greek beliefs, those in which spirits of the underworld or sea whispered truths to sensitive mortals? Even the Stoics, who came later, acknowledged the concept of sympathia, that all things in the universe are connected. That the groaning of the sea might echo a moral or metaphysical imbalance. That fear, properly understood, is a rational reaction to something beyond our comprehension. There's an anecdote preserved by Diogenes Laertius about the Cynic philosopher Antisthenes, who once stood at the edge of the Athenian port during a storm and declared, "The sea screams with the pain of truth." What did he mean? No one knows. Some think he was mocking local priests. Others suspect he was reflecting on the death of a friend lost at sea. But some fringe scholars suggest it was a reference to a now lost teaching, something older, never fully absorbed into the philosophical canon. There is also a lesser-known fragment attributed to Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher of flux, that reads, "The sea is both pure and impure, drinkable and undrinkable, it bears life and takes it." In this duality, Heraclitus may have grasped something the later thinkers circled warily, the sea as a symbol of unresolvable contradiction. It is natural, but it does not conform to nature. It is beautiful, but it conceals. It gives life, and it takes. All of this suggests that beneath the Athenian philosophers' veneer of logic was a quiet awareness that not all things can be explained. That some parts of the world, especially the sea and the depths beneath it, belong to a different order. Not irrational, but beyond reason. So when we imagine Socrates or Plato walking along the port at night, staring into the black waters of the Saronic Gulf, it is not impossible to believe that they, too, felt the pull of something deeper. Something ancient. Something unknowable. And perhaps that is why they never mocked the older stories. Why they preserved the myths even as they built new frameworks of thought. Why they never quite tried to disprove the monstrous. Because part of them, however small, believed. Next, we'll explore how ancient Athens tried to protect itself against the unknown, not with swords or ships, but with something stranger, curses, amulets, magical inscriptions, and the restless dead. As the shadow of night draped itself across Athens, when the markets closed and the philosophers retired to their homes, another class of citizens emerged. Not politicians, nor orators, nor priests, but magicians, midwives, necromancers, and the fearful. They moved in silence through alleyways and sacred groves, carrying wax figurines, scraps of lead, and thin coils of hair. They carried their terror of the sea and the underworld not in words, but in spells. For beneath the logic of Plato and the democracy of Pericles lay something darker, a city tangled in rituals meant to guard against forces it could not control. You might imagine that magic and superstition belonged only to the fringes of society, peasants or slaves grasping at strange beliefs. But in Athens, magic was both everywhere and nowhere. It was illegal, yes, but it was also common. Curses were buried in graves near the PNYX. Amulets were worn even by children of aristocrats. And when something truly terrible happened, like a merchant ship vanishing into the Gulf with all hands, citizens didn't always turn to reason. They turned to ritual. Let us begin with the curse tablets, depictions. These were thin sheets of lead, inscribed with names and invocations, then folded and buried. Hundreds have been found across Athens, many near the Acropolis and the cemetery of Kerameikos. They are often simple in their wording, "Bind the tongue of Diagoras, who speaks against me," or "Let the horses of Aristarchus fall before the race." But some are far more elaborate. One particularly chilling curse, now housed in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, reads, "I call upon Chthonian Hermes, Persephone of black robes, and Hades who sees all. Let the limbs of Menandros grow heavy. Let his eyes see shadows. Let the sea reject him and the wind scatter him, for he has wronged me." Who was Menandros? We don't know. But the imagery is clear. The sea is invoked not as a place of escape or commerce, but as a hostile force, capable of turning against a man if properly commanded. Other curse tablets reference Kimata, the waves, as living things. Some urge Poseidon to twist the waters against an enemy, or call upon ancient Nereids to drag the sails down. It seems the Athenian people, even as they worshipped sea deities, also believed the sea could be magically manipulated, weaponized. And these spells were not just meant to harm, they were also used as protection. Fishermen carried small lead amulets carved with tridents or waves pierced by daggers. Sailors painted eyes on the bows of their ships, yes, for navigation, but also to see danger that the crew could not. Even the temples near the ports, like the sanctuary of Amphitrite and Poseidon at Sunium, had inscriptions that blended prayer with enchantment, invocations to still the wind, or blind the gaze of the evil one beneath the waves. Some of the most curious magical items found are dolls, figurines with twisted limbs or bound with wire. These weren't toys, but effigies. Often buried in graves, they were meant to bind a person's spirit or protect the living from what the dead might carry back from the sea. Archaeologists have unearthed these beneath homes near the Agora, suggesting that even the political heart of Athens was not immune to superstition. It's in the graves themselves, though, that we see the most potent fears. Some burials include heavy stones placed on the chest of the deceased. Others are sealed with nails driven through the coffin or clay shards spread around the skull. Scholars interpret these as apotropaic measures, intended to keep something in. This suggests that Athenians believed the dead might rise and bring something with them. Perhaps something they encountered on the sea floor. There are even a few cases, disturbing and rare, of individuals buried face down, with their mouths stuffed with lead or coins. These may have been considered dangerous or cursed individuals, perhaps drowned at sea, returned to shore, and treated with suspicion. In ancient beliefs, a death by water could signal divine punishment. And such individuals were often feared even in death. Magical papyri from later centuries, many copied from older Greek sources, include spells to ward off the whispering voice from beneath the waves. This phrase appears in at least 3 surviving scrolls, though no one is entirely sure what it refers to. Was it metaphor? Or memory? Even public buildings held echoes of this fear. The Erectaion, one of the most sacred structures on the Acropolis, was said to house the marks of Poseidon's trident. According to legend, when Athena and Poseidon competed for the patronage of Athens, Poseidon struck the rock with his weapon, and salt water sprang forth. The sound of waves was said to echo in the chamber on windy days, no matter the season. The Athenians maintained the spot carefully, never sealing it, as if afraid that doing so would anger the god or trap something in. And here is where the threads pull together. For all its democracy and rational debate, Athens was not a city without fear. It was a city of layered beliefs, where philosophers spoke of forms and souls while women whispered prayers to the sea. Where laws condemned necromancy, yet graves bore traces of magical rites. Where the ocean was both gift and threat, and where some dared to curse it. The fear wasn't always spoken. It didn't have to be. It was etched into the walls, buried under stones, and woven into the very rituals of the city. Not because the Athenians were primitive, but because they understood, better than most, that knowledge and mystery are not opposites. They are twins. Next, we descend into the hidden tunnels and cisterns beneath Athens. Forgotten spaces that may have once been used in ancient rites or served as passageways for the initiated. What secrets lay beneath the city's marble skin? As the sea winds whisper across the quiet stone ruins of ancient Athens, and the moonlight gently brushes the Acropolis, we find ourselves not in a library, nor in the bustling agora, but in the hushed sanctuaries of marble and clay, in the visual world of Athenian art. Here, legends were not merely told. They were painted, carved, etched, and immortalized. Imagine yourself stepping into an artisan's workshop nestled near the ceramic quarter. The soft scraping of chisels, the rhythmic tapping of wooden mallets, and the low murmur of potters fill the cool, shaded space. It smells of clay and earth, and the air hangs heavy with the dry scent of powdered pigments and kill smoke. Before you, a wide-eyed apprentice carefully outlines the curve of a serpent's body onto a ceramic crater. The kind used to mix water and wine at a symposium. Around the serpent, a tiny ship is sketched in full sail, and a terrified figure leans over the rail, mouth agape, frozen in an eternal moment of panic. This is not just any serpent. It is Katos, the monstrous sea creature of Greek myth, slithering through myth and into the dinnerware of aristocratic homes. By the 6th century BCE, the image of the sea monster was already deeply entrenched in artistic conventions. Vase painters, the storytellers of terracotta, portrayed the beast with imaginative flair, a dragon-like head, a coiling tail, and sometimes flippered limbs or rows of teeth set in a twisted jaw. It wasn't realism they sought. It was emotional impression. And so, the sea monster took on forms both frightful and majestic, depending on the tale it accompanied. In many depictions, you'd find the monster locked in a mythical duel. Perhaps Perseus hurls a spear toward it, poised between rage and heroism. Or Heracles, muscles taut and lion skin draped across his back, braces against its charge. The story of Andromeda, chained to a rock and awaiting her seaborne doom, was especially popular. It wasn't merely a rescue tale. It was an allegory for sacrifice, salvation, and the unpredictable nature of the sea. These images did more than decorate pottery. They encoded Athenian fears, ideals, and dreams. Art was not separate from life. It was a mirror of it, albeit a dramatized, mythic mirror. When Athenians drank wine, dined, or offered sacrifices, they were often surrounded by the symbolic monsters of their cultural psyche. The Katos was a reminder of chaos beyond the polis, of the dangerous unknown, and of the heroes who might confront it. Yet the sea monster didn't remain confined to household items. The great temples and sanctuaries of Athens also bore witness to its legend. On the pediments of stone temples, creatures from land and sea twisted and writhed among gods and giants. Though Katos itself wasn't always central, marine creatures symbolizing primordial fear often lurked at the edges, curling waves and gaping jaws rendered in stone relief. Inside the theaters, too, the sea monster swam. Greek tragedies sometimes referred to ancient beasts as metaphors for fate, divine punishment, or political danger. While the audience never saw a literal monster on stage, the threat of one, from the ocean, from the gods, from within, was a common literary undercurrent. There was also an architectural dimension. Some scholars believe certain temple friezes, with wave-like patterns and serpentine forms, may have subtly referenced marine chaos. These weren't overt representations, but rather stylistic nods to the cultural significance of the sea, and all that it might hide. The Parthenon itself, though focused on Athena and her triumphs, held layers of meaning. In a city that prized wisdom and rationality, the mythic was never far behind. Some interpretations suggest that parts of the temple's decoration, such as the Gigantomachy and Centauromachi scenes, symbolized the perpetual struggle between order and chaos. The sea monster, though not directly pictured, belonged to that broader symbolism of untamed forces. Over time, as Athens transitioned through its classical and Hellenistic phases, the sea monster remained a versatile figure. Sometimes it symbolized exoticism, the dangerous East, or the strange lands far beyond the Aegean. Other times, it was simply mythic nostalgia, a reference to earlier, golden ages when heroes wrestled with the deep. In Athenian coinage, the monster appeared only occasionally, and usually not in Athens itself, but in colonies or cities with close cultural ties. But these depictions reinforce the idea that the legend had currency, both literal and symbolic. The sea monster, whether feared or admired, was never forgotten. And as Christianity spread across the Hellenistic world, many of the older myths were reinterpreted or quietly faded from civic importance. But the sea monster, in a way, evolved. It became Leviathan. It became the devil's fish. It became the unexplained splash in the dark. Even in the margins of medieval manuscripts, a coiled beast sometimes appeared beside scriptural scenes, an echo of the creature once feared beneath Athens. So, in these dusty ceramics and temple carvings, in these theatre scripts and architectural flourishes, the sea monster lived on, not just in the minds of frightened fishermen or curious philosophers, but in the very fabric of Athens' visual and cultural identity. As you gently drift among these forms and figures, imagine the artisan's steady hand, the soft hum of a chisel shaping stone, and the long-forgotten stories whispered into paint and clay. The sea, though distant, always reached the city, in symbol, in myth, and in art. And through that art, the monster beneath Athens swam quietly through the centuries, eternal, unseen, and utterly unforgettable. As we draw nearer to the end of this curious tale that slumbers in the folds of Athens' forgotten shadows, let us slow our pace and step quietly into the artistic soul of ancient Greece, a realm where images spoke louder than proclamations, where symbols were vessels of memory, belief, and fear. In this penultimate chapter of our journey, we will explore how sea monsters, real or imagined, crawled from watery depths into the minds of artisans, poets, and philosophers, becoming not only mythic creatures but symbolic anchors in Athenian culture. Imagine yourself wandering through the shaded colonnades of the ancient agora, where pots, sculptures, and murals glimmer beneath a soft Mediterranean light. On every corner, on every urn and painted vessel, scenes unfold, heroes battling serpents, ships swallowed by waves, or great fish-like creatures with gaping mouths and coiling tails. To the modern viewer, such images might seem decorative or fantastical. But to the ancient Athenian, they were layered with meaning. One of the most recurring motifs in Athenian pottery and temple art was the sea itself, not as a tranquil expanse, but as a realm of chaos, transformation, and trial. The sea was unpredictable and powerful, and within it dwelled figures both majestic and terrifying. The monstrous Katos, for instance, appears frequently, depicted not just as a brute creature, but as a spiritual adversary. This serpent-fish amalgam, long-bodied with rows of teeth and fins like blades, was more than a fearsome beast, it was a metaphor for the unknown. When ancient artists painted Perseus slaying the Katos to save Andromeda, they were not merely retelling a heroic myth. They were expressing an eternal tension between order and chaos, between mankind and the primordial unknown. The sea monster was a symbol of everything outside the polis, beyond the city walls, beyond the grasp of reason, beyond the safe harbor of civilization. The fact that these sea creatures appeared so often, even when not strictly required by the narrative, suggests a deeper fixation. Pottery from the classical period, especially from the late 5th century BCE, often features stylized renditions of marine beasts in scenes that weren't always mythological. One might see a sailor battling a creature in the waves, or a ship disappearing into a whirlpool as tentacles rise around it. These were not random flourishes. They mirrored a persistent anxiety, an artistic echo of fears that lay just beneath the surface of daily life. We must remember that Athens was a maritime power. Its empire, its economy, even its food depended on ships. And with ships came risk, not only of storms or pirates, but of vanishing into a world that felt alien. Sailors returning with tales of giant octopuses, of whales mistaken for islands, or of sea serpents lurking near unfamiliar coasts, fed a growing repository of folk memory. And though most Athenians may never have set foot on a boat, their imaginations sailed far and wide through the art they consumed. Consider, too, the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Saunion. Perched high above the sea, it faces the vastness of the Aegean. Within its columns and friezes, sea-themed decorations abound. It is here, as pilgrims offered sacrifices to the sea god, that the distinction between belief and symbolism blurred. To stand before that temple in ancient times, watching the sun set beyond the waves, was to be reminded of Poseidon's domain, and of the beasts he commanded. But the symbolism wasn't confined to religious imagery. It also bled into philosophy. Plato, for instance, in his later works, used the sea and its monsters as metaphors for human ignorance and the wildness of the soul. In the Phaedrus, he warns against diving into the depths of rhetoric without understanding, likening such folly to being consumed by unseen forces. The idea that knowledge required navigation, as one would sail a ship, was deeply embedded in the Athenian psyche. And if one strayed too far, they risked encountering monsters. It's also worth noting how Athenian theatre embraced the sea and its creatures. In tragedies and satyr plays, the sea often symbolized fate and the uncontrollable. Euripides, in particular, wrote extensively about characters who journeyed across the sea only to meet their doom, or who were transformed by its power. The sea monster, then, was not just an antagonist, it was fate made flesh, unpredictability made visible. In vase paintings, the color scheme often enhanced this sense of dread and awe. The dark, glistening background, usually a deep black or reddish slip, made the pale, undulating bodies of the creatures stand out in sharp relief. Tentacles, fins, and gaping maws curled across the ceramic surface, suggesting movement even in stillness. One particularly striking amphora from the 4th century BCE shows a merchant ship surrounded by 4 identical sea creatures, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths open in silence. The symmetry is almost mathematical, yet the message is unsettling. No matter which direction one sails, the monster is already there. Such depictions may not have told of a literal beast living beneath Athens, but they reflect a symbolic truth, that Athenians, despite their intellectual brilliance, feared the uncontrollable, the chaotic, the submerged. In this sense, the monster was always metaphor, yet metaphors have power. And in a society where dreams, omens, and myths blended seamlessly into daily life, the line between metaphor and reality was porous. We must also consider the audience for such art. Pottery was not reserved only for the elite, it was sold, used, and admired across classes. The stories told through these images reached merchants, laborers, housewives, and children. For some, it was entertainment. For others, it was a warning. In times of war or plague, depictions of sea monsters may have taken on new meanings, representing not just distant dangers but the lurking threats within the city itself. A failing navy. A cursed voyage. A god angered by hubris. And so, as you recline back in time among the quiet halls of an Athenian villa, or along the pebbled streets of the Potter's Quarter in the Kerameikos, you can imagine how these creatures stirred within the minds of those who lived and labored here. To them, the sea was not just a place, it was a presence. And the monster beneath it, a symbol, a warning, perhaps even a prayer. Let your mind drift gently now as we prepare to explore the final chapter in this tale, a reflection on how belief in a sea monster beneath Athens was shaped, sustained, and ultimately faded into the mists of memory. As we near the end of our long, meandering stroll through time and tide, we turn our attention to the slow fading of the sea monster beneath Athens, from a feared creature of the depths to a figure of folklore, a curiosity preserved more in story than in certainty. The myths and fears that once rippled across the minds of ancient seafarers eventually lost their sharpness, blunted by centuries of changing knowledge, urban growth, and shifting spiritual landscapes. But as we'll see, even as belief dimmed, the idea of the monster never truly disappeared. It merely transformed. Imagine yourself centuries after the height of classical Athens. The city had become part of the Roman world, and then later the Byzantine realm. New religions swept through the streets and over the hills, bringing new beliefs about the world and its wonders, and gradually transforming the way people thought about the unknown. In early Christian writings from the region, monsters of the sea did not vanish entirely. But they were recast. The dark waters that once symbolized chaotic gods or elemental forces were now more likely to symbolize sin, or the unseen temptations of the devil. Stories of sea creatures were not erased, but reinterpreted, sometimes absorbed into morality tales, cautioning the faithful against venturing too far from spiritual safety. And yet, the harbor below the cliffs of Athens, once the rumored haunt of a hidden beast, never completely shed its air of mystery. As the ancient world crumbled and the Middle Ages dawned, maritime knowledge shifted. With fewer large ships and less frequent long-distance travel during certain centuries, the sea once again became a place of the unknown, the uncharted, and the perhaps unknowable. Travelers passing through the Saronic Gulf in the 9th or 10th century may still have heard tales of things beneath the water. The difference was that these stories now wore the softer clothing of legend, tales for telling, not truths for fearing. Local fishermen, even in more recent centuries, sometimes passed along the old stories, not always with fear, but with a kind of reverence. They knew the waters well, but even the most seasoned among them might admit, after a strong drink and under the stars, that there were things in the sea one could not quite explain. Some scholars believe the legend of the sea monster beneath Athens slowly morphed over time into the broader Mediterranean tales of sea dragons, serpents, and leviathans that became common across cultures from Spain to Turkey. Each tale had its own name, its own particular twists. But the idea remained the same, that beneath the waves lay something older, darker, and more mysterious than the human world above. In the Age of Enlightenment, as natural science rose in prominence, and marine biology began to take shape as a field, many such tales were finally cast off as superstition. The scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries were eager to relegate ancient fears to the dustbin of irrationality. But even then, the myth lingered in quieter corners, in oral traditions, children's rhymes, sailors' yarns. And so the sea monster beneath Athens passed from dread into drama, and then into dream. In more recent decades, archaeologists, folklorists, and historians have re-examined such legends not for evidence of real beasts, but for what they reveal about human imagination, about the fears and fascinations of those who lived long before us. The myth, in this light, becomes not a mistaken belief, but a mirror. It reflects how people once saw the ocean not merely as a place of trade and travel, but as a living force, one to be feared, respected, and, in time, storied. Even today, if you visit the Athenian coast, you may hear a whisper of the old story. A tour guide might mention the sea beast in passing, with a wink. A local storyteller might evoke it for dramatic effect. A diver, exploring the seabed near the port, might jest that they're on the lookout for the monster's lair. Of course, few, if any, believe it anymore. But belief is not always the point. Because in stories like these, we glimpse a thread that runs through all human history, the need to explain, to imagine, to give shape to the shadows. In this way, the monster beneath Athens still lives, not beneath the waves, but in the deep, quiet waters of our collective memory. As we close this final chapter, allow yourself to drift back up from the ancient depths, through centuries of wonder, fear, and storytelling. Feel the rhythm of waves gently fading, the hush of myth settling like soft silt. You've walked the shadowed shorelines of imagination, and now, it's time to rest. Whenever you look out over a dark and silent sea, remember, every culture has seen something in the deep. And perhaps that, more than the monster itself, is the enduring truth. Now, as the world grows quiet around you, let your thoughts soften. Let the steady rhythm of history lull you into rest. You are safe. The waves have stilled. The monster sleeps. And so may you. And now, gentle traveler, as we close the worn pages of this long and quietly curious tale, let us linger for a little while on the final reflections, like the last rays of moonlight shimmering on the calm waters of an ancient sea. We've taken a slow and thoughtful journey, not across a turbulent ocean, but through time, myth, fear, and faith, descending gradually from the marble heights of Athens into the hidden depths of the human imagination. In the folds of this story, we've wandered through harbors filled with mystery, heard the whispers of long-lost sailors, and stood beside philosophers, priests, and storytellers who tried, in their own ways, to explain what dwelled beyond the veil of sight. Was there ever truly a sea monster beneath the coast of ancient Athens? In the strictest, scientific sense, probably not. No fossil remains, no modern sightings, no sonar traces or skeletal evidence tell us that a biological leviathan once stalked the Saronic Gulf. And yet, perhaps that's not the most important question. You see, history is not only the study of facts etched into stone and recorded in ledgers. It's also the quiet art of listening to the voices of those who came before us, to the anxieties they carried, the dreams they nurtured, and the stories they whispered when the stars were high and the waters were black. The monster beneath Athens, whether real or imagined, reflected something deeper than bone or scale. It gave shape to fear, mystery, or the very things that humans have always felt when they stood at the edge of the unknown. Ancient seafarers were not merely naive or foolish. They were practical people, traders, fishermen, soldiers, who understood the sea better than most of us today ever will. But even they, with all their knowledge, sometimes encountered moments they could not explain, strange sounds beneath the waves, inexplicable shifts in tide, shadows moving just out of view. When such things happened, they did what humans have always done. They told stories. And from those stories rose creatures, some terrifying, some beautiful, some wise, and some monstrous. These beings served not only to explain the unexplained but to mark the limits of human control. They reminded people that, beyond all their knowledge, beyond the reach of sail and oar, there existed realms untouched by certainty. The sea monster of Athens might have been born in a real event, a whale strayed too close to shore, an earthquake disrupting the seabed, or perhaps a shipwreck witnessed in eerie half-light. Or it might have grown purely from the minds of those who stared too long into the deep. We may never know. But what we do know is that the legend endured. Through changing dynasties, shifting gods, rising and falling empires, the story remained. It was reshaped, renamed, relocated, but it never vanished completely. Because every culture, no matter how advanced or rational, holds tight to its mysteries. And every coastline, no matter how familiar, hides a shadow or two. Even today, in an age of satellites and submarines, we haven't explored all of our oceans. There are still places where science dims, where sonar goes quiet, and where the imagination resumes its ancient role. In those dark pockets of the world's waters, we feel something primal stir within us, a quiet thrill, a flicker of unease, a gentle echo of the old fears. That is where the monster still lives. Not in the depths of the sea, perhaps, but in the depths of our minds. In bedtime tales and whispered legends. In fantasy novels and curious footnotes of history books. In the dreams of children and the half-remembered stories of grandparents. The monster survives because we still need it, not to frighten, but to remind us that we do not know everything, and perhaps we shouldn't. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's good that we don't. Because what would a world without mystery look like? A sea with no shadow, no whisper of danger, no flicker of something ancient just out of view. It would be efficient, yes, safe, perhaps, but would it not also be dull? The ancient Athenians, for all their wisdom and inquiry, still left space in their world for wonder. For awe. For monsters. And maybe we should too. So if you ever find yourself standing by the shore, whether on the rocky coast of Greece or the soft sands of another place entirely, take a moment. Let your eyes drift to the horizon. Listen, not just to the waves or the wind, but to the old, quiet part of you that remembers what it felt like to not know. Let yourself wonder what might be just below the surface. Let yourself believe, even for a moment, that something ancient and unseen still swims beneath the waves, just out of reach, just out of sight. Then, smile at the thought. Because the sea monster beneath Athens may not have teeth or fins or scales. But it has something better. It has endurance. It has imagination. It has you. And now, dear listener, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow quiet, let yourself be rocked gently by the slow currents of time. You've walked with myths, sat beside philosophers, peered into the dark waters of history, and emerged, not with certainty, but with calm curiosity. Let that curiosity lull you now, like the tide. Let the hush of ancient waters wrap around you, soft and cool. Let your mind drift. You are safe. The sea is still. The story is complete. And the monster sleeps. Good night.